In this video, we're going to look at the timeline in Moho. Notice that the timeline has 3 different tabs for 3 different modes. We're going to start out in Channel View. One important thing to make sure you remember about the timeline in Moho is that there is a frame 0. Even though you can see by this green arrow that the animation doesn't actually start until frame 1 and on. When you're on frame 0, Moho is in designer mode. Everything that you do in Moho besides actually animating should be done on frame 0. So this is where you would do all your drawing, character rigging, and scene setup. In fact, you might want to go up to the main preferences, and then the timeline tab, and turn on highlight frame 0. Then the stage will get this red highlight when you're on frame 0 in designer mode. Next, let's talk about setting keyframes on the timeline to create animation. Keyframes are placed on the timeline at a specific frame and define the state or value of some property like position, rotation, color, line thickness, basically anything. Pretty much anything you can control, you can animate with keyframes. Let's try an example. You've seen me do this a couple times. I'm going to make an animation of this shape sliding over. Here on frame 0, I'm going to use the layer transform tool to move the square into position for where I want it to start its animation. Then, starting on frame 1, I'm going to just click on the square to set an initial keyframe. So that automatically makes an animation channel and gives us the first keyframe. You can tell by the icon, which looks like the layer transform tool, that this is a channel for the translation property or position property of the currently selected layer. I'm also going to set a keyframe for the rotation of the layer because I want to animate the shape rotating while it moves. So still with the layer transform tool, if I come out to the corner, the tool icon changes to rotation mode, and now if I click, it adds a keyframe for rotation on its own channel. Then let's come out later on the timeline, and we're going to define the end position for the shape. Let's say we want this animation to take 2 seconds. Since the frame rate we set for our project is 24 frames per second, 2 seconds would be 24 times 2 or 48. So let's find 48. By the way, you can use these buttons over here to zoom in and out on the timeline to see more or less at once. You can also see by this orange region along the top where the end of your animation will be. We can animate past that, but it won't get exported. So let's zoom in so we're roughly looking at frames 1 through 48. Then with the playhead at 48, I'll just move the shape to its new position and also rotate it. Now it will store the total amount you rotate it. So let's say I want to turn 3 times as it travels. I would just rotate it 1, 2, 3 times. Up here you can see the total degrees something has been rotated. And we can play the animation. Now it's going to keep playing for the whole movie, so let's temporarily change the endpoint of the movie to 60. And now when we play it back, it will go back to the beginning and loop shortly after the end of the move. Now after you have keyframes, you can move them around. So say you want the position change to finish before the rotation, you can just click and drag the end keyframe earlier. And if we want the shape to return back to its original position, we can select those 2 original keyframes using Command-C to copy and come out later, and Command-V to paste. Change our end frame since we're out of range now. And then when we play, the shape goes back exactly where it was. Now, let's say the whole animation is good, but everything is positioned incorrectly on the stage. Well, to fix that, we would need to adjust the position of all the keyframes by the same amount. That's what this relative keyframing setting is for. With this on, you can select keyframes, and then any change you make will get applied to all of them. So let's click the channel, and that selects all the keyframes. Then we can move the shape, and it gets moved the same amount on all the other keyframes. Just make sure to turn it off when you don't want to use it. You'll also notice a checkbox for auto freeze keys. That's mostly relevant when you're animating a character rigged with bones, so I'm going to hold off on talking about that till we start animating with bones. We'll get into the nuances of how to do animation with keyframes later. Right now, I want to cover some features of the channels themselves. These are things that could be handy down the line but aren't obvious. First of all, the layer translation or position channel is a special kind of channel. Remember, the position is actually 3 different values, the X, Y, and Z coordinates. By default, they're all keyframed on the same channel. But if you want, you can right-click and choose Separate Dimensions. Then you get 3 different channels, which can be helpful if you want to make those changes at a different rate or offset them like we did with position and rotation earlier. If you don't need them separate, right-click and rejoin dimensions. In fact, if you want, you can do something similar with all channels for a layer. You can right-click and choose Consolidate Layer Channels. Then all the channels for the layer get condensed down to 1. You can still see the timing of wherever a keyframe is, you just can't see what property it's on. To separate them again, just right-click and unconsolidate layer channels. Next, you might have noticed this green dot next to each channel. This lets you double-click to mute and unmute a channel. When a channel is muted, the animation of that property will not be visible on the stage. So you can see we mute the rotation property on our first shape. That would let us focus on just the position animation. Or we could do the opposite and look at the rotation without the position animating. And one last thing about channels, remember that by default, only channels for the selected layer will be visible in the timeline, unless you check the channel visibility for the layer. Then its animated channels will be visible even when another layer is selected. This lets you reference the keyframes on another layer while you're animating the current one. Also, along the top, there are drop-downs for the default interpolation and interval. We'll cover those concepts in detail when we get to animation, but basically interpolation is the easing or the acceleration and deceleration between keyframes. And interval is a way to basically change the frame rate between keyframes. So you can specify that animation play out every single frame, every 2 frames, 3 frames, etc. The important thing to know is that these drop-downs just change the default for when you make a new keyframe. To change the values on an existing keyframe, you right-click on it and you have the easing and interval options here. You can kind of see by the spacing on the dots on the motion path how the different interpolation settings will change the speed as the shape travels. Though in this case it's a little unclear because it's going back and forth over the same path. If you want a clearer visualization of the easing between your keyframes that offers a lot of control, you can switch over to the motion graph view. This view shows the change in values on your channels with a line graph. The steeper the curve, the faster it's moving, and the less steep, the slower it moves. Now, depending on how big your value changes are, this graph might be going off the screen, or maybe be too subtle to see. To fix that, you can use the scroll wheel on your mouse to change the vertical scale of the motion graph, or you can try the auto zoom button. Also, you could specify the scale of the graph here. So if you put in 20, the graph now goes from 10 up top to -10 at the bottom. And right now we can see the center of the graph is at 0, but if we want, we can come up to this box and change that. But an easier way is to just right-click and drag, and that will let you scroll the center point up and down. Now you might run into a situation where your graph is too busy with too many curves from different properties, so you can disable those and just focus on specific curves at a time. So for example, I'll right-click and do Separate Dimensions so we see X, Y, and Z values separately, and you can see they each have separate channels. If I only want to look at one of them at a time, I can click to hide the graphs for the other ones. Eventually, we'll spend some time here on the motion graph, and you'll come to understand how powerful it is. But for now, let's go back to the channel view, and keep going over these settings up top. The next option you have here is onion skinning. This lets you see faded versions of the previous and later frames for you to reference while working on the current frame. Now, enabling onion skinning by itself won't do anything. You have to make sure that you click to enable at least one marker down here on the timeline next to your playhead. You can enable markers on up to 8 frames, any ones that you want, either forward or backwards, and it will show them on the stage. On this drop down here, you have the options that control how onion skinning is displayed. You can set it to outlines, to only see outlines, or you can disable the red and green color fills it puts on them. Then there's the option relative frames. With this on, the onion skin markers follow your playhead as it moves around. With it off, the markers stay where they are and it always shows those specific frames. Then there's selected layers only. If you turn this off, it's going to show onion skin views of all your layers at the same time. Then the last option is draw behind, which makes sure the onion skin views are always behind the current frame. And if you want, you can use this button to clear all enabled onion skin markers. So the last button here we haven't tried yet is the Add Marker button. This lets you add a text label to a particular frame. And you can specify whether you want it to be a document-wide marker, which will be visible on the timeline no matter what layer you have selected, or if that's unchecked, it will only be visible on that particular layer. You can move your markers, double-click to edit them, or hit delete to delete them. Now, the last view we haven't looked at in this video yet is the sequencer. This displays your timeline and all of your layers in a way that's more like how you'd find in a video editor, with each of your layers as a track on the timeline. You can move around your layers to make them start sooner or later. And if you want the contents of your layer to disappear entirely at a certain frame, you can go to the layer settings and toggle the visibility. And the track now has an end. Now, where the sequencer is really going to be most useful is for audio. So I'm going to add an audio layer and find my audio track. And you can see it adds it where I had my playhead, and I can move it around so it starts whenever I want. And if you look back on the channels view, the waveform shows up there so you can animate to the audio. By the way, notice we have a new channel and keyframes here. This is from when we changed the visibility back in the sequencer view. I'm just going to delete this keyframe here where it switches to invisible to make it visible again for the rest of the timeline. Now on the sequencer, there are a couple buttons here specifically for dealing with audio. There's the Restart Audio button. We've got to make sure we have that audio layer selected. This lets you come out past the end of your track, and then if you hit this, it will restart the audio. Then there's the Audio Level button, which lets you specify the volume level for the track at a given point. Now keep in mind, what it's actually doing is setting a keyframe for the audio level. If we go back to the channel view, you can see we've got an audio channel now, and this is the keyframe we just set. If we were to come out later in the sound, and then switch back to the sequencer, and adjust the audio level again all the way down, now when we go back to the channels view, we can see between those two keyframes, the sound is actually fading out. You can tell by the waveform. And of course, you can delete the keyframes to get the sound back how it was. Lastly, I want to point out a particularly good use for the sequencer, and that is to divide your animation into scenes. For example, in the built-in example project, Zorbatron, you see the layers are organized in a few top-level folders, which each contain a scene. Then on the sequencer, the folders are dragged out and the visibility of those scene folders is turned on or off to make it cut from one scene to the next. So that's it for the timeline, and that's it for our overview of the interface. Next, we're going to look more closely at our drawing tools. We'll do that in our next series of videos. I'll see you there.